to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, the special program that we are commemorating, celebrating the establishment of the State of Israel. And we have the pleasure today of having Avi Melamed, who will be interviewed by Dr. Halley Faust, and we look forward to this program. As we begin, I'd like to mention that Dr. Faust lived in, I will introduce him first, and then he will introduce Avi Melamed. He lived in Israel for some time. He's been a board member of the Ben Gurion University and the Israeli-based Masorti Foundation for Conservative Judaism. He was on the development committee of the Mason, a Jewish response to hunger, and has been an active participant in the North American Conference on Ethiopian Jewry, and been involved in the college sponsorship program, under which he helped more than 50 students attend university in Israel. Halley is currently the chairman of the Santa Fe Middle East Watch, and until recently was on the executive committee of the National Council of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. His credits go far beyond what we can enumerate today, and I would like to introduce you to Dr. Faust.
Thank you, Ron. And first, let me give my condolences to Gloria on the loss of her brother. May his memory be a blessing. Avi Melamed is a geopolitical Middle East expert. He's an intelligence analyst, an author, and he's founder of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives. With a history as a former Israeli intelligence official and senior advisor on Arab affairs, Avi's appeared on NPR, The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, NBC, and The Today Show, among others. He's fluent in Arabic, English, and Hebrew, and he's recognized for his understanding of current affairs in the Arab and Muslim world and their implications on Israel and the broader Middle East. His deep familiarity with the Arab and Muslim world has enabled him to anticipate key regional events. After his years as an intelligence officer, he worked as a senior advisor to Jerusalem mayors Teddy Kollek and Ehud Olmert, and then as a fellow of intelligence of the Eisenhower Institute in Washington, D.C., and he then founded the Middle East Institute, Middle East Strategic Intelligence Institute, and he's written recently in 2021, as you can see behind me, published in 2022, I guess, his book, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. My guess is there will be a new edition given what's been happening in the last couple of years, but I don't have that confirmed from the author yet. Maybe he can do that. Avi was born and raised in Jerusalem. He lives in Hadera. Don't go swimming with the sharks, please, Avi. And those of you who visited Israel know Hadera is just north of Netanya and just south of Caesarea, or Caesarea, depending on how you wish to pronounce it. So thanks for being with us, Avi. And let me just ask you from the beginning, in terms of your book, you state, evolving tensions between realpolitik and idealpolitik, combined with a very fragmented understanding of Western policymakers regarding the multifaceted complexity of the Middle East, have made it increasingly difficult for Western policymakers to formulate a coherent Middle East policy. Western policy in the Middle East has failed because of a, quote, looping echo chamber, close quote, in which concepts became facts, narratives became reality, theories exempted from the test of validity became truth. Critical thinking and media literacy are not encouraged, and conveyors of knowledge are exempt from professional accountability for the validity of their theories and analyses. Can you expand on how this happened, and it continues? I think in talking to people who are Arabic speakers who follow the media in the Middle East, they see how there are significant misinterpretations in say, English and other languages.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, shalom, good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here. Ali, thank you so much for the introduction. Ron, thank you for the opportunity of this important forum. Yes, indeed. I think this is one of the major challenges when we are looking at the whole issue of Western policy and Western discussion generally vis-a-vis the Middle East. Following or expanding what you have quoted from my book, Halley, I would say that I'm in the midst or towards the end currently of almost 1 year of a very intensive lecture tour across North America, particularly working with students in campuses, which was one of the major audiences, but not only them. And more than once, I came across a situation where students, and more than that, people that have been studying Middle East professionally in campuses in the States were very much shocked to hear what they heard from me, because they basically says, we never heard about what you were talking about. And so I think that's part of this whole challenge that you have very accurately presented. I think that one of the major clearly catalysator of that challenge is the impact of social media. Of course, we all understand that in the age of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on and so on, everything become very shallow. Everything become very artificial. It's all become basically a sound bites and slogans discussion. We had very good examples of that. For example, following what October 7 and what we saw in different campuses and different circles in the West, where people are both sides are basically echoing slogans and rhetoric, and there is very small room for constructive discussion. And so in our work professionally, in our NGO inside the Middle East, what we are trying to do is really to provide this apolitical knowledge that is so essential if you really want to expand or create a positive, constructive discussion. And very often, this is the feedback that we get from people who say, now we get context, we get facts, we get a nuanced understanding. And so now we feel that we are standing more on a ground that enables us to have a constructive discussion. I think that this is one of the major challenges we have to deal with, not only in the context of the Middle East, but because one of my major arguments is that the harmful impact of this very shallow sound bites, narrative-oriented discussion is that it basically further fuel polarization. And I think that we could see that very clearly.
So when this happens in universities, it's obvious, and we have young people who have some influence through their protesting, if you will. But it concerns me more, I guess, when it happens through the media and even through politicians who have power, as well as through those who are influential outside of it. I have a cousin who was in the Defense Department, who was a Middle East expert at the time, and right after the Iraq War started, he would travel with journalists in Iraq, and he found that the journalists were reporting what the translators stated, but the translators often were giving political messages based on their own background and biases, not uh, not reporting what the person actually said. How do you see this when you monitor the Middle East, and how can it be? I don't want to say combated, but how can it be corrected? These errors in what we see, sometimes even by Israeli or ex-Israeli um, journalists who are reporting for U.S. outlets.
Yes, I mean, Harry, this is one of the most significant components. This is what I call the glass on the table. What does it mean, the glass on the table? It is so transparent, you don't see that, but it's there and it's very significant. The glass that I'm referring to is the language. In other words, one of the things that kind of like skipped the understanding of the Western circles is the fact that you just mentioned very accurately that Western audience does not master the languages, overwhelmingly, of course, does not master the languages of the Middle East, and particularly Arabic, which is a major language. So they are dependent upon translated and transmitted and transformed information. That information, as you mentioned, sometimes is partially translated, sometimes is deliberately manipulated. Sometimes it's inaccurate. Just the same, the outcome of this whole process is that in the end of the day, the end user, namely the Western audience, actually gets, in the best case scenario, gets a very small part of a large picture that is totally remained obscure to him or to her. So this is, of course, one of the major challenges. In other words, they challenge the barrier of language. How do you address the challenge of language? Well, one way, of course, is to learn the languages. But this is something not easy. It takes time and so on and so on. Today, in our times, again, this kind of like what I call the double-edged sword, when technology can come to our aid. And today we have all kind of like, apps and programs that can basically translate from one language to another, which is helpful. But yet again, as a consumer of information, we have to be enormously careful with the translation that we receive. We should leave some significant, wide area for suspicious or asking questions about the authenticity and reliability and accuracy of the information translated. I'll give you an example from yesterday. I saw on Twitter, an Arab blogger was publishing on Twitter, allegedly, a speech made by the Israeli chief of staff, allegedly basically saying that Israel is going to eliminate the Turkish presence in Syria. Obviously, for me, immediately, that was already suspicious enough for itself. That statement is not a statement that you would expect to hear from the Israeli chief of staff. The interesting thing was that allegedly there was a video showing him allegedly saying that, and there was a translation of the script in Arabic in the bottom of the video, where basically the translation says, allegedly, the chief of staff says that Israel will eliminate the presence of Turkey in Syria. Obviously, when I listened to the person that was speaking, that was basically imitating Hebrew, it was very clear to me that the person, though he was speaking in Hebrew, that was not his mother tongue. So it was very clear to me that this is something that is fake. The interesting thing was that that was not perfect, but there was synchronizing between the lips movement of the chief of staff and the allegedly voice. And so I bring that as an example, once again, of the very challenging reality that is becoming more and more challenging in the age of AI for us to understand and extract as much as possible accurate picture of a very complex reality.
You also mentioned the idea that journalists and others flatten a complex reality sort of into a simplistic discussion. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, I mean, when you look at the role of media, Western media, and you see the frame and the circumstances and conditions the Western media operates within, we are all looking at something that is very instant, sort of speaking, oriented. You got 15 seconds to talk about that. You got 20 seconds to talk about that. You are sitting in a studio. You got 5 people in a panel. You got 4 minutes total, and people are interfering. In other words, you are looking at an environment that, from a media perspective, is very much discouraging ability to insert some valuable information or perspective. So it becomes sound bites, it becomes slogans, it becomes sometimes, unfortunately, a little bit more sensationalist affiliated discussion rather than a substantial content discussion. And the inevitable outcome of that is that the media that is on the one hand playing a very significant role in shaping public opinion and public discourse, at the same time the media is becoming also the victim of its own inner mechanism that is very much not encouraging a real process of educating. The issue is, in the end of the day, that many people, and you mentioned before, and I think to a large extent it's very valid in that regards, that, like, for example, policymakers and politicians are basically synchronizing their agenda, their language, their outlook to the media, because this is the world that they have to function in. The inevitable outcome of that is that also policymakers and politicians and community leaders and others are basically also find themselves to a large extent subject to the pace and features that this very challenging discussion of media is dictating. And the bottom line of this whole process, it is all percolating to the end consumer, the wide public, the wide audience. The bottom line, inevitably, is that there is a very, very, I would say, limited ability to understand a complex reality.
So how would you get across, and what do you think are the most important of the geopolitical sort of misunderstandings that occur? You mentioned some in your book, the Shiite versus Sunni or Arab versus Persian, et cetera. Of those that you list in there, and I again advise the audience to get a hold of your book because it is very comprehensive. Which ones are the forces that are currently most at play regarding misinformation or lack of understanding of the Middle East in Western ears?
Well, Harry, the best example I can give you, and not surprisingly, I would say, is in the context of what is called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And here is something interesting to notice, but now following our opening part of this discussion, I think it will be less surprising. When you look at the discussion in the Western circles vis-a-vis the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when you look at this discussion in the last 40 years, 4 decades, you see that the discussion, whether if it was in political circles or academic circles, intellectual circles or media circles, that discussion is constantly centers around the issue of two-state solution and peace. However, when you look at what happened on the ground, at the same time that this discussion was going on, what you saw on the ground was an enormous escalation of the conflict. I mean, in the last 4 decades, dozens of thousands of Palestinians and Israelis were killed. The discussion in the West was totally detached from what was going on the ground. One major explanation to this staggering detachment is because this discussion became, in the West, centers around the narratives and the arguments of the sides, both Israelis and Palestinians. And the discussion actually present those arguments and narratives of the sides as if they are the reasons for the conflict and for the escalation of the conflict and so on and so on. And if you just address those arguments on both sides, you will have a breakthrough. But when you look at the story of the escalation of the conflict for the last 4 decades, you see that it was, roughly speaking, overwhelmingly generated and fueled by larger forces and larger dynamics that happened in the Middle East, way beyond the narrow circle of the arguments and narratives of both sides. Those factors, those dynamics that happened in the region for the last 40 years totally were unrepresented in the Western discussion. They were absent from the Western discussion. And hence, there was inability of the Western discussion to really understand what's really going on the ground.
So, we naively hear often from our members of Congress where they'll append what we really need is a two-state solution. And, once we have peace, all of this will go away. You wrote in your book that from the beginning of your career, you've maintained the peace between Israel and the Palestinians is not feasible. It doesn't reflect an emotional or political outlook. You obviously would like there to be peace. But what are those major items that you say that are glossed over or forgotten or understood about what you're talking about now, the long-term dynamics, if you will?
Yes, that's a very significant observation. Indeed, for many years in my positions and not in my positions, overtly and so on, I said, look, a peace between Israel and Palestinians is not visible. It's not achievable, and it is a professional observation, not a political statement. By the way, I'm not engaged in what I call the game of blame. I found both Israelis and Palestinians responsible for the gloomy reality. The issue is that I said, look, the reason I made this very decisive and up until now, unfortunately, I would say, accurate observation is because I understood, based upon my intimate familiarity with both the Israeli as well as the Palestinian society, I understood that neither Israelis nor Palestinians are really able to come to the table to start the very complex process that could lead to a viable two-state solution. Why are they not able to do that? Because they have not gone through the very painful, convoluted, challenging inner process, each of the sides within itself. They have not gone through this process that requires significant, painful concessions and compromises over some core narratives and core demands. That's valid in the case of the Palestinians, and it is valid in the case of Israel. I can give you an interesting example on both sides that also can be associated with what we saw post-October 7 in the Western discussion. Let's start with the Israeli side. In the Israeli side, for example, the whole issue of the issue of Jerusalem, meaning Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, undivided, only under the sole sovereignty of the state of Israel, of course, including the holy sites in the old city of Jerusalem, is non-starter. It's non-negotiable. And when you look at the Israeli politics in the last 40 years, with the exception of a very interesting period of time back then in 2000, when back then the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak in Camp David summit with back then the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, basically Barak said, we can also discuss the issue of Jerusalem. That was an exceptional because since then, the consensus once again within the Israeli side was clearly wall to wall, the issue of Jerusalem is non-negotiable. So there was a very short period of time where there was some sort of like a break, sort of speaking, a breakthrough in the Israeli consensus, but then there was some sort of like retreat, if you want to call it that way, or going backwards. And this is, for example, the Israeli side. Up until now, the Israeli in a discussion regarding that is clearly unable to step out of this niche. When you look at the Palestinian side, the best example I can give is in the context of what is called the resistance. By the way, a concept that has been idealized and romanticized by some circles in the West following October 7, because it sounds very romantic, but it's not romantic at all. This issue of the resistance that basically is very much echoed by Palestinians and supporters, pro-Palestinians in the West, including, of course, those who basically identify as pro-Hamas, glorifying this resistance. The issue is that the resistance has inflicted an enormous death and destruction across the Middle East, and particularly inflicted an enormous destruction and death upon the Palestinians themselves. So right now, as we are talking, I can tell you, like an hour ago, I was reading an article written by a Palestinian scholar, Abdel Bari Fayyad, referring exactly to this issue of the resistance. And he basically said, he's Palestinian. And he says, those who are romanticizing and idealizing the resistance should know that the resistance is one of the major reasons for the fact that the Palestinians today are struggling an enormously gloomy everyday reality. And so you could see here the gap. So in the Palestinians themselves, there is still an ongoing discussion whether to support this resistance, Hamas way, or to reject that resistance. So in other words, as long as there is no ability within the Palestinians to decide whether they want to go the path of resistance with the heavy price it's inflicted upon them, or to detach that, you cannot really expect the point where the people should come to the table and be able to move forward positively. In other words, a long story short, being able to reach to the point where you can start talking about something that could be viable, reaching to that point requires an inner, complex, painful discussion within both sides. And this is a process that has to run its course.
On the Palestinian side of what you were just mentioning, do you see that discussion at all occurring? Who was it? Was it Golda Meir who said, when the Palestinians love their children as much as Israelis would love not to have to harm them? What, or something like that. I may have mangled that quote. But do you see that discussion within the Palestinians, in their media, in their leaders?
Yes, there is such discussion. By the way, there is such discussion also across the Arab world because to a large extent it was also associated with the story of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's also associated with other parts of the region. The issue is that the discussion is very challenging because the concept of resistance became almost sort of like what I call living, breathing organism in the Arab public realm and in the Arab psyche, I would even say so. I will explain why do I say that. I will give an example to explain why. Hamas that comes from this concept of the armed resistance, al-muqawama al-musallaha, basically that's what he markets to the masses, that's what he markets to the Palestinians. He says, look, we are going to liberate Palestine, we are going to eliminate Israel, and it's going to be done through the way of the armed resistance. And up until now, as a fact, Hamas did not liberate Palestine, he did not eliminate Israel, but he basically caused the biggest catastrophe ever upon the Palestinians, as the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas said. Now, following already before October 7, there has been a growing criticism in the Arab public discussion vis-a-vis the whole story of the resistance and Hamas, and because people in the Arab world basically turned to Hamas and said, well, with all due respect, you are talking about liberating Palestine and resistance, but meanwhile, what's happening is that you dragged Gaza Strip to death and destruction. What's going on? But then you got the counter camp that basically is a very passionate supporter of this concept of resistance. So following October 7, as you can imagine, Hamas is coming under a very significant criticism in the Arab world, including the Palestinian, but across the Arab world as well. By the way, this is a fact that is totally absent from the Western discussion. But people should be aware of the fact that Hamas is being held accountable for what happened to Gaza. He's being held accountable by his brothers, the Palestinians, and large sectors in the Arab world.
And not just the Western discussion, but also you never see anything in the Western media broadly, let alone within the political discussion. But go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted.
Yes, no, that's correct. I mean, there may be some cases I didn't come across, which speaks for itself. In just the same case. So following October 7, Hamas is coming under a massive criticism, and his leaders are appearing in different Arab channels and media and interviewing. And one of the interviews was with the former head of the political bureau of Hamas, Khaled Mashal. And Mr. Mashal is asked by the anchor in Arabic. He says, the anchor says, look, what have you done? You launched October 7, Gaza Strip is destroyed, there are dozens of thousands and fatalities, and what have you done? And so Mashal says in reply, he says, look, that is correct, he says. Gaza Strip is paying heavily. He says, the losses that we have in Gaza, he said, are tactical, referring to the loss of human life. But he added, the resistance, he said, is life and wealth. In other words, you got here an ideology or a blueprint or whatever, but not an organism that lives and breathes. All of a sudden, that becomes something that is living and breathing and is live and well. And so that explains to you the significance of that concept and the difficulty to kind of like cause this change of hearts and minds in parts of the Arab world, that still there are parts in the Arab world that still continue to glorify that concept. And going back to what we said about the fact that it is absent in the Western discussion, tragically, I would say, tragically, because the people that are, and legitimately, I'm not criticizing the legitimate choice of people to support Palestinians or to support whatever they want to support. But basically, those who are supporting Palestinians in the Western discussion, and talking about Westerners, should be aware of the fact that while they are exempting Hamas from responsibility, what they are doing by that is totally opposite of what they want to do. In other words, they are not helping the Palestinians by exempting Hamas from responsibility. They are not helping Palestinians by cheering and romanticizing resistance. What they are doing is the totally outcome. They are deepening the Palestinian misery and the Palestinian tragedy. I think that people in the West should be aware of those facts.
Yeah, it's somewhat tragic, and as you see people around here sometimes who are protesting, as at the Capitol and elsewhere, just on a mini perspective in the great state of New Mexico that doesn't have a significant voice in this whole discussion overall. You see that they just don't seem to understand the things that you're talking about. You mentioned this is only a 4-decade or 40-year problem, but don't you think it goes back much longer than that? I mean, there was resistance from the Arab countries before there were these pro-Palestinian separate militias and Islamic groups and etc.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there are episodes before those last 4 decades that also inflict, or I'm sorry, also represents the very partial understanding in the Arab world vis-a-vis the story of the conflict. The major example that I can give you in that regard is that during the decades, many decades of this conflict, uh, a center, I would say, a central outlook that became almost kind of like a canonic one in the Western outlook vis-a-vis the conflict basically said something like along the line that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the one shaping the trajectory of the Middle East. But when you look at the story of the Middle East geopolitics in the last century, let's put it this way, and its relationship with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you will find out that in the end of the day, it was mostly the Middle East geostrategic dynamics and forces and ideologies and challenges that in the end of the day inflicted the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so as a fact, in fact, I would say until the 1970s, it was mostly an Israeli-Arab conflict per se. And then from the 1970s, it basically kind of like turned more and more to become an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But once again, this whole process before the 1970s and following the 1970s was first and foremost dictated by the geopolitics of the region, the dynamics of the region, the inner power struggle of players in the region, the competing ideologies in the region. And that fact is even more emphasized in the context of the last 4 decades of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
As we 2-3 weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, you may know that we had Amir Tibon on speaking about what happened, and talk. He didn't talk as much about his book about what was happening internally in Israel now politically. If we zoom out now to go to those geopolitical forces and how they're working, two of the areas that are highlighted significantly, not just in your book, but in a number of your other presentations, are sort of how Turkey and Iran see the region. I don't want to exclude this to that, obviously, but if we can turn to Turkey, first of all, what is Erdogan's objective and how is he trying to achieve it? And is he succeeding in some way?
Yes, I think that President Erdogan is one of the most fascinating political leaders in the history. I mean, we are looking at a person that actually took a major state, Turkey, 85 million people nation, the second largest member in NATO, huge capacities, a state that was by definition a secular, and Erdogan actually changed Turkey into an Islamic affiliated state. Erdogan is coming from the hub of the Sunni Islamic slash Muslim Brotherhood circles. And he, I would say, generally speaking, once climbing in the steps of power in Turkey, he was the mayor of Istanbul and then the prime minister and then president. He gradually kind of like moved towards two major purposes. One is to position Turkey as the leader of the Sunni camp in the region, in the Middle East, but also as a frontline Sunni leader generally in the world, particularly looking at Central Asia. And the second component was to actually position himself as the leader of that camp and positioning that all under the banner of what we call the Neo-Ottomanism, meaning the restoring of the days of the Turkish Ottoman Empire that ruled the region for hundreds and hundreds of years. That policy, as for Erdogan itself personally, as I said, he's a very shrewd politician. He's a very cynical and sophisticated politician. As a fact, I mentioned he was changing Turkey dramatically. And one of the things that characterizes Erdogan is that he is constantly walking on the edge. He's looking for opportunities. He's trying to exhaust what he thinks are opportunities to enhance his objectives. And more than once, he has been walking on the edge, but he knows when to pull back when he identifies something that is pushing back against him and maybe something that could become counterproductive as far as he's concerned. So that ability, together with a very provocative steps and a very significant sophistication of reading the mindset of people, basically Erdogan, as you look at his policy for the last couple of decades, constantly has been applying those methods and tools, sometimes with a large success, sometimes with not. Sometimes it resulted in tensions, even collision between him and Turkey and major players in the region, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Israel as well, tensions with Iran. But that is Erdogan, and as long as he's in power, his presidency is supposed to be done and over towards the end of this decade. But there are some analysts that basically would not be surprised if he will come with some sort of like a trick out of his sleeve to basically bypass the constitution. But he's a very sophisticated leader, and definitely one that, in the end of the day, plays a very significant role in the region and beyond the region.
I mean, his whole strategy now, Syria has become part of his strategy. How does the toppling of Assad and the introduction of THS into the whole Syria area work related to his strategy? Do you think he has enough control there? And will this become sort of a head of his conflict-oriented area? And by the way, for our listeners, you mentioned that he wants to be the head of the Sunnis broadly, and the listeners should realize that the Sunni Shiite is one of the conflicts that you identify as being one of the major geopolitical issues that's been almost in perpetuity.
Right. Just shortly, since you brought this just for the audience, majority of the Muslims are Sunnis. They are about 84% or so. Minority are known as Shia about 14%. The Sunnis and the Shiites are both Muslims, but they have been fighting for centuries over the issue of leadership of the Muslim world. There are lots of theological and political and cultural gaps and opposing narratives of these two camps. And even though they are both Muslims in their religion, there is a lot of animosity between those two camps. Sometimes that animosity was translated into a violent collision between Sunnis and Shiites, including in our times. For example, you mentioned one of the major stages of such collision that happened in the last decade, and that is Syria, during the war in Syria. As for Erdogan in Syria, interesting enough, Erdogan was the one supporting those rebels' bodies in Syria, particularly the HTS. The HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is a congregation of Islamic Sunni Salafi jihadi radical groups, most of them based upon Syrians, but some of them also based upon non-Syrians. And those groups are coming from the hub of radical groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And Turkey has been supporting those rebels' bodies and also supporting in parallel another major Syrian rebel body, the National Syrian Army, that basically is coming from a more nationalistic perspective, not an Islamic one as the HTS. The bottom line of this whole story was that Turkey was the one beyond the offensive that those two rebel bodies launched towards the end of November, beginning of December 24, that resulted in the downfall of Assad regime in Syria in a very quick, a domino effect. Interesting enough, I'm not so sure that that was the final objective of Erdogan. Basically, he wanted to deal with two major issues regarding Syria that bothers Turkey a lot. One of them is the issue that there are 3 or maybe 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, that Erdogan was looking to send them back to Syria. And the other thing is the story of the Kurdish autonomy in the northeast part of Turkey, of Syria, that Erdogan views as a very significant threat to Turkish national security. So Erdogan was hoping that through a limited military pressure, through the offensive, Assad regime will be willing to dialogue how to find solution to those two problems. What happened on the ground was quite different. Assad regime was going down in 2 weeks. And now Erdogan basically, on the one hand, can mark itself a very significant achievement in the sense that it definitely has a lot of influence and power in Syria. But at the same time, also, we should understand that the HTS in Syria, the new rule in Syria, is in the end of the day, is coming from the hub of the Arab world. And the president of Syria, Ahmad al-Shara, which used to be known back then as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani when he was the leader of this HTS, he is now the new president of Syria. He's clearly saying, look, we are part of the Arab world. In the end of the day, we expect our Arab brothers to help us to rehabilitate and rebuild Syria. He went to Saudi Arabia. He went to United Arab Emirates, which are the big money supporters. And basically they say to him, we will do that. We are willing to do that, but it comes with a fee. They don't give a free meals. One of the fee is that he's expected to minimize as much as possible the ability of Erdogan to turn Syria into his backyard garden, which Erdogan is obviously trying to do. So this is from that perspective. There is another perspective, not less significant, and this is the Israeli one, because as I said before, Erdogan is very provocative. He has been constantly using the Israeli-Palestinian card to poke Israel, to harvest political dividends in the Arab world. Not so surprisingly, the same way that he was using all the time the story of Gaza Strip, he's starting here and there to use the story of the Israeli presence in the Golan Heights to poke Israel and to harvest political dividends. In other words, given to his skills and features and guiding policy, when we look at Erdogan in the region, you should always expect to some problems that are going to rise up. And we didn't even mention yet his very provocative, destructive role in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, in the Aegean Sea, his tense relationship with Greece and Cyprus, and so on. So we are looking at a major player in the region that is definitely, many times, quite too often, brings bad news.
So before we turn to Iran, which obviously we could do a whole program on, and I just want the listeners to know that we'll in about 5 minutes start taking questions, and you can put your questions in the Q&A, and Ron will be monitoring those. So Syria has gone really from being a bit of a puppet of Iran and Russia to now being, would you say, a puppet of Turkey? I don't want to overstate that, but also what is it that Israel needs to really watch out for now as HTS starts to ask for not just rehabilitation of Syria, but also uh, if they wish to start rearming in a way that Syria had been armed, that Israel's been having a fairly free will to go and destroy at this point.
Yes, the issue of the rearming of Syria is significant, particularly again in the context of Turkey, because Turkey has an enormous advanced military capacities and industry. And one of the major concern is that, the connection between Turkey and HTS will result in a process where Turkey will become more and more the major military umbrella of this new regime in Syria, with all the ramifications that come along with that. The combination of such a military power, Turkey, with a regime in Syria that is, in the end of the day, coming from a hub of a very radical ideology that obviously is, among other things, also is totally hostile to Israel and to Jews, by the way, and the flammable situation on the ground, and particularly the issue of the Golan Heights, all those components, in the end of the day, have a potential or seeds of a lot of challenges from an Israeli perspective. And now, if we will find ourselves in a situation where basically we are looking at an indirect Israeli-Turkey struggle, when Syria becomes the ring of such a struggle, that is something enormously significant. We are looking at two major giants in the region.
So let's turn a little bit to Iran built this circle of fire, which you discuss extensively in the book, and most people, I think, in our audience are familiar with how Hezbollah and the Houthis in Syria and Hamas, they all have participated. The militias in Iraq also, for example. Can Turkey build that circle of fire now? And that just as a quick question, but a little more in-depth question. What can Iran do about that now in their hegemony in the region? They seem to have lost a fair amount of power.
Yes, as for the first part of the question, I would say that potentially, yeah, Turkey, there is concern that we saw now the weakening of the axis of resistance that is backed by Iran, but now some people say what we may witness right now, the rise to power of a new axis, this time led by Turkey. I think that in the context of the ability to create physical stronghold in arenas bordering Israel, similar to what the Iranians did, I think that Turkey has a limited capacity to do that. I would, in that regard, pay a close attention, particularly to one state that borders Israel, that to a large extent was left out of this whole process, and that is Jordan. Why Jordan? Because Jordan is 97% Sunnis. There is a very strong presence and influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. We should definitely expect Turkey to increase excessively its attempts to influence in Jordan. This is something that we should definitely put a lot of attention to. So that as far as the Turkish potential ring of fire, as you mentioned before, it's less likely that they will build something similar like what Hezbollah was building in South Lebanon, or even what Hamas is building in Gaza Strip, because today there is a dramatic change in the situation in Gaza Strip. As for Iran, Iran marks a significant weakening because of the weakening of the axis of resistance, the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, and so on. The bottom line is for the mullah regime, there are experts, analysts that basically saying that 2025 may be the year that the mullah regime will face an unprecedented challenge to its existence as an outcome of the combination of three major factors: the weakening of the axis of resistance. I do emphasize weakening, it does not disappear. The weakening of the axis of resistance, the enormous challenges inside Iran, economically, socially, environmentally, and the pressure by Trump administration. And so we have to see, of course, how things will evolve in that regards in the context of the Mullah regime in Tehran.
I've got about 100 additional questions, and maybe we should do an additional 2 or 3 seminars, if not with the distinguished lecture series in other ways. Or maybe you can come out here and visit us and spend some time and
I'll be very happy to do that, hopefully maybe in one of my upcoming tours.
At this point, let's turn to the audience and see what questions they may have. And Ron, you're on. Thank you, Avi.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Leila Levy says, can you explain the difference or similarities between jihad and resistance in the Islamic world?
Yes, jihad is actually coming from the hub of Islam, the religion itself. Jihad means originally a spiritual effort. In the very early days of Islam, Islam was under the run. And so the first believers were expected to sacrifice emotionally and spiritually to exercise their deep belief in Islam. In course of time, Islam became a conquering expansion religion, building a huge empire, a caliphate across the region and beyond. And jihad became more and more associated with different things. One of the things jihad has become more and more associated was the commitment of the Muslim to either defend or proactively fight for Islam, even in the cost of his or her life. And so this is kind of like kind of like relatively modern version of this concept of jihad. Resistance, interesting enough, is actually coming from originally is rooted in the story of the Resistance in France. In other words, it's not coming from the hub of Islam, it's coming from a totally different background, different from jihad, that is an ancient story that evolved in time. Resistance in the Middle East basically appeared and emerged in the 20th century, and it has to a large extent been inspired by ideas that are coming from the socialist mindset and theology and ideology. So the common denominator of the resistance and the jihad is in the fact that they both basically offer, each one of them offering its own different path and way, they offer what they think is the solution for the challenges of the Muslim civilization. They both basically share the understanding that Islam, once a thriving and enormously successful civilization, has been declining, and the region, each one of them comes with its own explanation, what the reason is and what has to happen in order to restore the glorious day of Islam. So this is the common denominator. And in the last, I would say, third of the 20th century, there is a process where, in a way, there was an emerging at some circles of these two sentences or these two ideologies, particularly in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When Sunni radical Islamist group took the concept of jihad, basically, it was kind of like merging with this issue of resistance. But these are two different terms and ideologies that come from a different roots.
David Schulman asks, when will the window close for an Israeli attack on the Iran nuclear facilities?
Well, I make it very simple. I'm very exceptional Israeli, because if I don't know something, I'm basically saying I don't know. So my answer is I don't know. I don't know if there has been really such a window. I don't know to say. So hence, of course, I don't know to say when this window is going to be closed.
Judith K. asks, if you don't think that a two-state solution is a viable option, then what are the options?
I think that once we put that aside, understanding it's not achievable, it's in a way it's an advantage, because now you have a much more realistic bar to try and to set. So I always said, look, let's put it aside. Now the question is, what can be done and how should it be done? My guiding line was that there are two features that are the major pillars of potential progress in the context of the conflict. One is it has to be done in the context of a regional envelope. It cannot be detached from the region. It cannot be detached from the Arab world. The Palestinians are part of the Arab world, but in the end of the day, this is one significant component. And the other thing that I always emphasize is what I call thinking out of the box. We really need to come forward with a very creative way of thinking vis-a-vis the trajectory ahead of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that the guiding blueprint should be a graduate constant attempt to build what I call scaffoldings that are going to be done in a frame of a regional envelope. Scaffoldings that will enable Israelis and Palestinians to move from one stage to another stage in a very gradual, long-term process that could take decades and maybe has to run its course. And parallel to that, there should be measurements or steps that will be sort of like thinking out of the box. For example, I said, let's detach ourselves from the physical dimension, and let's basically think about creating some sort of like an external virtual entity that basically is reflecting the regional envelope, the involvement of international players as well, and that virtual entity will basically act as a semi-real entity on the Palestinian side that will be mandated and authorized to move forward, to sign agreements, to come with ideas and suggestions. Maybe that entity will have some sort of like a virtual passport and citizenship status that will be offered to Palestinians for that period of time, not negating other rights. And that basically will enable them to continue and to develop the infrastructure that is required to be able, when the day comes, to function as an independent state next to the state of Israel in a good intention and in a good positive trajectory. So this is what I call an idea or suggestions of like thinking out of the box, trying to move forward with this process. Once again, we have to think out of the box.
How would you say, Avi, how does that differ from the ABC approach of the Oslo Accords, for example?
It's very much different because in the end of the day, the ABC dealt with the physical dimension, which already was doomed to fail. And the ABC and the Oslo Accord basically said, look, we are going to leave the big issues somewhere on the shelf. One day we'll get to these issues and we'll deal with that. That was doomed to fail. And that's the reason why I'm saying, look, let's come from let's detach from the physical dimension. And let's come from a different perspective. Let's come from a different mindset that basically could be positive and contributing in that regard.
I might mention
we have a number
there's a five-episode part called The Seam Line that Avi did, I guess several years ago, that the audience might be interested in terms of the pragmatic dialogue that he says. So thank you.
And thank you. There are a number of other questions left, but Avi has another speaking engagement that starts immediately. And so we have to leave at this point. And Avi, Halley, thank you very much for this discussion.
Thank you.
We look forward to continuing information like this.
Thank you so much for the stage and the opportunity. Stay well. Be in touch.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.